4. Teeth. Our Doris has never been one for dentures. She's proud of the fact that she is one of 3 members of the Partridge Mews Women's Institute who still has her own teeth and has never had a filling. It's not for want of trying, mind you. We used to go to this dentist in town, Mr. Alderson. He were NHS. Our Doris won't go private because she's worried about funding an illegal immigrant's ingrown toenail surgery. Now, he weren't a young man himself, Alderson, but our Doris doesn't go in for ageism. She were fond of his practice and Royal Doulton tea set in a vintage 1950s sideboard. She's always had a thing for pine furniture, said it were a sturdy wood, but was only really suited to farm dwellings or small town dental practices. Mr. Alderson's room were nothing short of a cubbyhole. Before this dreaded day, she called it cosy and said how being close to your dental professional gave a sense of comfort. She said at least there were no space to fondle you. Well, Mr. Alderson got our Doris in his chair. Montavani were playing in the background. Our Doris insisted on bringing her own tape because she couldn't have it going round that she listened to BBC Radio 2. Alderson were there, churning out numbers to the dental nurse, when he decided to find a cavity. He looked at our Doris like something from The Wind in the Willows. He were all ginger and he said to her, "You're going to need a filling, Mrs. Copeland." Our Doris moved that fast, she knocked the floating light into the nurse's head. Our Doris was seething, all beetle eyes and sucked lips. She said to Alderson, she yelled, "Who do you think you are to go spreading rumours like that?" "You have a cavity, Mrs. Copeland," Alderson repeated, clearly a man who hadn't learnt to play dead when faced by a bear. "I have a cavity. Have you heard him, Arold? I have a cavity." She turned on him at that point and said to him, she said, "I'll give you a cavity in your bleeding great forehead in a minute." The nurse piped up at this and said, "We will not tolerate violence towards our staff." Violence? Violence? He wants to drill into my teeth and you call me violent? You're making it up so you can charge me extra. Sitting there thinking that because I am a heterosexual white woman with conservative leanings and a penchant for floral blouses from the British home stores that you can charge me an extortionate amount for a bit of tinfoil on my molar. She bundled her coat in her arms, something she wouldn't usually do because she'd bought it from the boutique for £80, and she warned against flashing your size labels at anyone in case they used it against you to your circle of friends. She faced Mr. Alderson, and she said to him, she said, "I'm afraid that the state of your practice is in need of a spring clean. There is a certain air of damp, and I'm not sure I can support a dental practice where there is a definite sense of menace and underhand goings-on. From now on, I and my family shall see Mrs. Patel of Tudor dwelling." He closed within a year. Our Doris intimated he was no good to the WI who removed their families. The rumour mill started up, and a young lass of the council estate claimed her son's milk teeth wouldn't have fallen out so early if she hadn't been to Mr. Alderson. He ended up moving to Prestatyn with the vicar and opening a B&B. They adopted a cat. That were a few decades ago. Our Doris must have got word around somehow. She never did get that filling, but she has chipped a tooth. You'd think that after 72 years she'd know you can't bite straight into a strawberry bonbon. I warned her, I did. I said to her, "Your teeth are buggered as it is, our Doris. You can't just crunch straight in. It's not a licorice torpedo." And that's when she gave me the look. She scrunched her brow, opened the bag, and with one "watch me," dove right in. There was a crack. Her eyes went from pinched to gawping, and she had a moment of realisation. No, you can't bite straight into a strawberry bonbon. She opened her mouth and spat out the sweet and half an incisor. Fury pooled on her lips, and I thought to myself, "Arold, you're a dead man." I could see the headlines. "Wife kills husband for knowing too much." Our Doris screamed like I never heard her scream before. Even in childbirth, she was too busy wondering what shade of mauve to wear to the christening to let out a serious whimper. One chipped tooth and I knew I was done for. There'd be no need for a casket. Our Doris was going to eat me alive. She opened her mouth till her jaw cracked and yelled at me. I'm positive she yelled, "Look at what you've gone and done, Arold. 72 years of age, no dentures, never had a cavity, and you come along and dare me to eat a bonbon. What will Marcia at number 42 think when she sees me? What am I going to do? I held back all tooth fairy comments and rang the dentist. Our Doris hadn't been sat there a minute when Mrs. Patel hit her with the bombshell. She said, I'm afraid I'll have to extract the tooth, Mrs. Copeland. I thought our Doris were going to throw a fit. I started glancing around, looking for somewhere I might be able to hide. I was sat at the kiddies' table, were considering flipping it on its side and making a shield when our Doris piped up with, That is quite all right, Mrs. Patel. I trust you completely. One must, you know, in these uncertain times. However, I would like to pose the question as to how you will endeavour to replace the offending incisor. I have been invited to the Antiques Roadshow by Miss Janice Dooley of Little Street. And I could see the cogs whirring in Mrs. Patel's mind. Most folk are aware of how to deal with our Doris. She's high maintenance, but once you do as she wants, you're sorted. Only I didn't think Mrs. Patel would ever be sorted. She said to our Doris, There's always the possibility of veneers or a crown, but honestly, your tooth has an incredible infection. I'm surprised you haven't noticed something before. I come from a long line of ancestors with high pain thresholds. My grandfather once played a rather smashing round of golf with a dislocated shoulder. Granted, he almost decapitated the coach of the women's volleyball team, but these are occupational hazards. It will require a fair amount of work. I cannot guarantee you'll have your crown by the Antiques Roadshow. It is a week away, Mrs. Patel. I am quite sure you'll have an adequate amount of time in which to service my teeth. After that, Mrs. Patel reached for the local anaesthetic and I kept quiet. Our Doris's pain threshold didn't last as far as the needle penetrating her gum. She wailed at Mrs. Patel like a banshee giving birth to a 10-ton kidney stone. Her hands clenched the arms of the chair and her toes curled more than they ever did when we were amorous. Mrs. Patel finished, and our Doris sat there, her face sagging a little, the temporary crown stark white against her other teeth. I were glad she were off her face, because if she'd seen herself, she'd have torn it out and used it as a weapon. When we got home, our Doris fell down onto the sofa with all the pomp of an inebriated hippopotamus. I said to her, Do you fancy a brew, our Doris? And she told me, as her fifth cousin twice removed on her father's side had a thing for special brew, and she'd always wondered about the flavour. I hadn't the heart to tell her I meant PG tips. Once the anaesthetic had worn off a bit, she started poking and prodding the crown with her tongue. I could see her there like Eddie Sykes trying to hide a gobstopper in Mr. Morris's class, but threatening our Doris with a slipper wouldn't do much good, so I said to her, You should stop messing with the crown, our Doris. And she said to me, more of a drawl than anything, I'm not doing anything. I said, I can see you. And she said, You couldn't see Eleanor Stockwell's knickers when she flashed them at the summer fete. You most certainly cannot see me pressing me tongue against me teeth. Well, not now you're talking, I said. I thought she'd rip out my jugular, but she sat back in the sofa and said to me, Do make a mug of tea, Harold. I could do with a drop of rum, for purely medicinal reasons, of course. Should you be having alcohol? Should you be questioning it? I had the Captain Morgan out of the drinks cabinet when the phone rang. Before I could get to the hall, the slurred, dulcet tones of our Doris spurred to life with, Good afternoon. You've reached Mrs. Doris Copeland of 22 Shakespeare. Oh, hello, Angela, the orthodontist. I reached the lounge to see that look in our Doris's eyes. Not the one that expresses that you've raised the fury of 7 hells in her, but the one she gets when she's thinking about something, considering how what she's being told could be used to her advantage. It's why it took her 3 days to accept when I proposed. The best part of an hour passed before our Doris got off the phone. I went in to her and said, What's our Angela got to say for herself then? We're taking Thea to the orthodontist tomorrow morning. It's half term, so it's the day off school. I thought perhaps we could take him for a spot of lunch at the Hare and Horse. Did you forget about my tea? Honestly, Harold, I thought you might have it ready by now. Next day, I sat in the car park waiting for our Doris to get back with Theo. She'd left me with the copy of the Times I kept stashed in the glove compartment in case our Doris came along for the ride. I change it every few weeks. She went to visit her Auntie Phyllis once, Mavis's mother. We never got on. I might have said, and are a bit squiffy on sherry trifle at the time, I can see where Gargoyle gets it from. Her mother's as stony-faced as Ben Nevis. I weren't invited back. And now Phyllis were on her deathbed, and if I didn't want to see her living, I most certainly didn't want to see her dead. Mavis had started telling folk that the sight of me was enough to shock her mother to death, and she's got friends in the right places as Mavis. I'd be imprisoned before the funeral. To get all things bright and beautiful, I'd be singing for me supper. Our Doris must have been by Auntie Phyllis's side for 11 hours. I fiddled with the different knobs on the radio, discovered a station that played Pam Ayres on repeat, heard Richard Torber at one point, and weren't that a blast from the past? When I needed to empty my bladder, I knew I were beggared. I couldn't mosey on up to the house and ask whether I could relieve myself. I had to hold it. I considered letting it go and claiming incontinence, but I know that our Doris would bury me alive if I let myself go in a jacket from John Lewis. I dozed off at one point, only to be awoken by our Doris planting a fist on the horn. She said to me, I can't believe you'd be so disrespectful, Arold. I know you didn't get on, but there's no need to sit outside our house looking untidy. And that's when I decided to keep a newspaper in the car. I considered putting National Geographics in the motor after that, but I knew that she wouldn't settle for anything less than the Times. She isn't that happy about me reading the newspaper in the car as it is, calls it common, and says I could at least pretend to be interested in the world around me. But she'll let it slide as long as I'm reading a newspaper she's approved. I only had to wait about half an hour before they were back in the car. Theo had his shoulders hunched and I knew something were up. I know teenage boys are meant to go around being loutish, with the possibility of breaking into the allotment and uprooting me petunias, but our Theo isn't like that, partly because of his grandmother, and partly because he's never been one for getting filthy. Our Doris, meanwhile, had her head held high, although she did have a scarf wrapped around her mouth. I considered gagging her years ago, but I always worried someone might see it as sexual rather than an act of humanitarianism. Theo sat back down in the car and stared straight ahead as our Doris got in. I said to him, how'd it go? He spoke slow. I think he's learnt that if you want our Doris to take you seriously, you have to speak in slow and measured tones. I tell you, if he already knows how to speak to Doris, he'll be Prime Minister one day. He said to me, she is never bringing me again. I looked at our Doris and I said, what happened? Her words were muffled behind the scarf, but she said to me, the orthodontist and I might have had a mild disagreement. I flashed a glance at Theo in the back and said, we'll talk about this over dinner. At the Hare and Horse, whilst our Doris were using the facilities, I said to Theo, what happened? He launched into a right tale, he said. He'd just tied to my braces when Nan piped up with, I wonder if you'd mind taking a look at me teeth. Only I saw a dentist yesterday and she says I need a crown. Would it be possible for you to have a specialist alternative device? She's lost a tooth, not an iPhone. And Mr. Shepherd said, I'm afraid I have another appointment after this, but if you speak to my receptionist, I'm sure I could squeeze you in. Is that enough for my grandmother, though? No, some people get grandparents who are good enough to be senile. And who do I get? Mrs. Doris Copeland. I said to him, what did she do? He sipped his British shandy like most young lads do. He wanted a drink, but he weren't that impressed with the flavour. She went ballistic. She said, do you believe the NHS was merely invented for youth with dental crookedness? I had a bowl cut until I was 17. I understand these matters. My grandson is here as a patient. All I am asking is that you take the simplest glance at my teeth and then we will be on my way. He couldn't help her, Grandad. There was a girl from St. Ormerod waiting to have headgear removed. I choked back a snigger and said, I'm supposing it didn't end there. Theo shook his head. She said that she's got the Antiques Roadshow coming up and did he think she could do that looking like a hillbilly? What's she talking about, Antiques Roadshow? It's to raise the profile of the garden safari, I said. Janice Dooley at Little Street is going on with a vase she found in her mother's loft. Why is Nan not taking anything? I said to him, the oldest thing about our house is your grandmother. She's younger than you, he said. I said, you're not wrong there. The truth is that when our Doris found out the Antiques Roadshow is coming to the leisure centre, she went on a raid of the house. She were determined. She put curry in her Tupperware so it would appear aged. She never used them. Maintains that Tupperware is the sign that one has eyes too big for the belly. One should never waste as much as to warrant the use of Tupperware. Still, she believed that an authentic used Tupperware dish might elicit some emotional reaction from someone. She got it into her head that her cutlery had stamps on them. I said to her, when in 54 years of marriage have we ever afforded silver cutlery, our Doris? There were a time we couldn't even afford paper cups. She held a finger to her lips and said to me, if you think that we have not been able to afford something as simple as cutlery, Arnold, then how come we could buy a shed that blocks my view of Mrs. Whitstanley's garden? I left it at that and she hopped off to the jeweller's. When she came back, her face had shrunk in on itself. If I hadn't known better, I've said she'd swallowed a lemon. She dropped her bags and moaned. She said, "Bleeding jeweller couldn't tell gold from cornflakes. I would have given him what for if it hadn't been for the antiques." And that's when I noticed the newspaper. I asked her, I said, "You get the Gazette sent to you, Doris. What are you going after buying it for?" She shook her head and flashed the front page. There she stood in all her glory, wearing a gold blazer beside the headline that proclaimed she had found an antique. I didn't have time to read it myself before our Doris exclaimed. She said, "Janice Dooley of Little Street has discovered an antique vase she believes could be from the Ming dynasty. If she hasn't had it as hush money from Violet Grey, I'd be surprised." She should have taken her teeth. They're the most antique things she owns. At the pub, our Doris returned with her scarf pinned around her mouth. When Linda brought the food over, our Doris said to her, she said, "This scarf is not a religious statement. I believe I am developing a sore throat and do not wish to aggravate it." Linda nodded her head and went off to give Mrs. Butterworth her port and lemon. I said to our Doris, I said, "What are you saying things like that for? You know she'll tell everyone next chance she has." Our Doris nodded, a glint in her eye. She said to me, she said, "I should hope she does. I can't have it getting around that I am in need of a crown. I doubt that orthodontist can keep his mouth shut. Lord knows he didn't whilst we were there, asking me about my bonfire night. There's a reason the hall is exclusive, you know." When we got home, me and Theo went into the lounge and our Doris checked her messages and set about the telephone. I'm glad I don't get to look at the phone bill anymore, because even with 3 calls, I'm confident the cost would turn my blood pressure to rocket fuel. The countdown conundrum were just flashing across the screen when our Doris walked in, scarf hanging from her shoulders, eyes wide. She'd bypassed the look by that far. I'm not sure she knew what her eyes were doing. She said, more of a roar than anything, she said to us, "You'll never believe what she's gone and done, Harold. I should have known she'd do something like this. It's typical. I don't know why I didn't anticipate it." Theo piped up with, "Who?" I shrank back into my armchair as our Doris's tirade continued. She said, "Janice has only gone and had the Antiques Roadshow moved to this Saturday. Apparently it's more convenient for the television crew. That bleeding orthodontist must have let it slip. Has he never heard of the Hippocratic Oath? Where's my patient confidentiality?" "You weren't his patient, Doris," I said. "I saw his hands. Do you think I'd let him anywhere near my mouth?" Theo's hands were in his mouth faster than Alf pocketing a pork pie. "You let him near mine?" "You're young. Your body is made to fight infection. I'm going to have to get in touch with Pandra. She'll circulate the rumour that I have an issue with me throat, and by the time it reaches Janice Dooley, it'll be laryngitis." Our Doris applauded herself and stopped. I said to her, I said, "What's wrong?" "I can't, Harold. This is meant to secure our place as 5th house. We'll get Mrs. Patel on the phone. I'm sure it won't take too long for her to replace this monstrosity." And with that, our Doris revealed the white fang that jutted from her mouth like a crag from a mountain range. Mrs. Patel couldn't help her. I were in the garden the next morning digging up my keller lilies when our Doris stormed down the path, leaving her bag at the back door. Her scarf was back in place, her words muffled as she said to me, she said, "Do you know what that Mrs. Patel said? She told me that her technician didn't work that fast. I said, it's a matter of urgency, but did I get anywhere? Me, a heterosexual homeowner? Did I buggery? Her hygienist wouldn't be much use to a rugby team." I went back to my gardening and our Doris went to write a letter to the Gazette about how the Antiques Roadshow had helped to raise the profile of a small-town women's institute. Saturday came and our Doris made us wait outside the leisure centre while she readjusted a floral scarf she felt accompanied her cream Bon Marche blazer quite appropriately for an upper-middle-class event. She said to me, she said, "If this isn't a Ming Dynasty vase, Harold, I'm going to make sure Janice Dooley never leaves bleeding Little Street." I straightened my tie, followed her inside and said to her, I said, "I bet you will, our Doris." A television crew filled the leisure centre. Our Doris found Pandra and they went to stand seemingly in the crowd, but close enough to Janice to make an impression. I joined the other husbands in the doorway. Eddie had snuck in a pick and mix and a hip flask. We made our coffees Irish and settled down to watch our wives do what they did best. The vase were huge. You'd expect to see it on a show like this, or Downton Abbey, or one of those ones where folks send stuff to auction. I were almost glad that our Doris didn't bring her Tupperware. She'd have become one of those jokes, just like that lady who took in the gold dust and it turned out to be paint. She should have sent the video into you being framed. At least she'd have earned 250 quid. I couldn't really hear what went on, but Janice spent the first 2 minutes smiling and telling a story. Once the presenter started talking, her face fell. It were like watching someone having a stroke before my eyes. That'd be a first for television, an OAP dropping down dead on the Antiques Roadshow. I didn't have to wait for long to find out what happened. Our Doris practically skipped back over to me. Her scarf had slipped and revealed her fang. She were that happy she linked arms with me. I said to her, "What's gotten into you, Doris?" "You'll never believe it, Harold. It's not a Ming Dynasty vase." "I thought you said you'd make her stay in Little Street," I said. She said, "I had to leave, Harold. I could have wet myself laughing. Pandra's had Jeff take her down the pub." "So what is it?" "A bit of old tat they used to sell back in the 70s. Apparently everyone and their cousin had one." "I wouldn't." "Did you see it? Can't you imagine that in a provincial semi-detached house in Shakespeare Avenue?" "You flashed your crown, Doris." She must have been high off something because she said to me, "Yes, me crown, Harold. I've always thought I could be royalty." "It's part of your tooth," I said. "It doesn't matter where it is. I have it, and it's a damn sight more impressive than that vase, I can tell you."